Eric stood at the long table in the center of the alien council chamber. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to keep his thoughts clear. The room was filled with 100 of the galaxy's most powerful beings, representatives of Stara's vast empire, all of them watching him with eyes that seemed to burn through him. He had been sent on a mission to negotiate a peace treaty between his people and the alien empire. But as he looked around the room at the alien faces, his mind kept racing. He had never been this nervous before, but this wasn't just any diplomacy. This was a meeting with Queen Sara, the ruler of this empire, the most feared and respected queen in the galaxy. He had studied her in detail for months. Her reputation was legendary. She was a woman of few words, but each one of those words had the power to shift the galaxy in a new direction. No one had ever dared to challenge her authority. She ruled with an iron fist and had crushed rebellions with ease. Her strength was unmatched. Her intellect was sharper than any blade. And yet here he was standing in front of her and the council, trying to propose a solution that would keep both sides from plunging into war. The meeting had started off in typical fashion, with each side laying out their demands and concerns. But everything Eric had planned for suddenly seemed insignificant in the presence of the queen. He had come to see her as a distant figure, a powerful entity that would either make or break the fate of billions. But standing there, facing her eyes that seemed to pierce into his soul, he could barely think, let alone speak clearly. The air was thick with tension, his throat dry, his hands trembling as he tried to maintain his composure. The other representatives from the human delegation shifted uncomfortably at his side, clearly noticing his unease. But none of them dared to speak up. They all knew how fragile this moment was. If this negotiation failed, there would be no second chance. The humans had no leverage here. They were at the mercy of the queen and her empire. The room fell silent for a moment as Queen Sara leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Eric's face, her eyes cold and calculating, as if she were reading his every thought. He could feel the weight of her attention pressing on him, and for a brief moment panic surged through his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words escaped him. Nothing came out. The silence stretched on, and Eric's nerves began to unravel. The tension was unbearable. The entire council was waiting for him to say something, anything to break the silence. But his mind was a blur. All the carefully rehearsed arguments and points he had practiced for days now felt irrelevant as he stood there before her. And then, in a moment of pure panic, his mind disconnected from his body. The words spilled out of his mouth without warning, without thought. Queen Sara, I propose we unite through marriage. His voice echoed through the chamber as the words left his lips, and the shock that followed was instant. He froze, staring at the queen in disbelief. His heart seemed to stop for a second. His face flushed with horror. The entire council gasped. At once the humans exchanged nervous glances, while the alien representatives stared at him with wide eyes. Some looked confused, others clearly angered, but all of them were stunned into silence. Queen Sara did not react at first, her expression unreadable. Her lips remained in a thin line as she studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if considering what to do next. Eric wanted to crawl into the ground, to disappear, to take back the words that had just ruined everything, but the damage was done. The room was still dead silent as Eric tried to recover his composure, but his words seemed to echo louder than before in his ears. The proposal had been a mistake. He never meant to say it, never even thought of it as an option, but in the heat of the moment, it had slipped out now. He was trapped in the consequences of his own failure. The tension in the room was unbearable. But it was then that something completely unexpected happened. Queen Sara leaned back in her chair, her face softening ever so slightly, and a slow smile spread across her lips. Eric blinked, not sure if he was seeing things. His mind was racing, trying to process the situation. What was happening? Was she mocking him? Was this some cruel trick? But no, the smile remained, a small but genuine curve of her lips. She leaned forward slowly and spoke, her voice calm and steady. I accept your proposal, she said. Eric's world spun around him, the words barely registering in his mind. He stared at her in disbelief. The queen had just accepted his blunder of a proposal, and before he could even process the situation, the room erupted in murmurs, shock and confusion, rippling through the council as the implications of her acceptance began to sink in. Eric stood frozen as Quensara's words hung in the air like a storm cloud that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He blinked again, unsure if he had heard her correctly. She had accepted his proposal. The powerful ruler of an entire empire had just agreed to marry a human diplomat who had made a complete fool of himself in front of her council. The room was buzzing with shock and disbelief, alien voices murmuring in hushed tones all around him. Some were questioning the Queen's judgment, while others seemed to be calculating what this sudden twist in events meant for the future of their empire. But Eric couldn't focus on any of them. His mind was racing too fast, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He turned his gaze back to Quensara, her piercing eyes locked on him, her expression calm, almost unreadable. Yet there was something in the way she looked at him, something that made his heart race and his palms sweat again. She wasn't angry, no, she didn't seem angry at all. Her smile remained small but genuine, as if she hadn't just agreed to the most ridiculous proposal in the history of diplomacy. The Quen's voice broke the silence again. "This is an unexpected turn of events," she said, her tone soft, but her words carrying an undeniable authority. "But I believe this is the only way forward to solidify the future of our two worlds." She stood slowly, her presence commanding the entire room to fall into a tense stillness. "Your people may not understand this decision, but it is one I believe to be necessary." Eric could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Now all eyes were on him, the humans waiting for his reaction, the aliens trying to gauge the situation. How could he respond to this? How could he even begin to comprehend what was happening? He felt as though the floor beneath him might swallow him whole at any second. But before he could say anything, the council member began to speak up one by one, their voices filled with skepticism and concern. Some questioned the Queen's decision, while others began to argue openly about the implications of such an unprecedented marriage proposal. The discussions were rapid and heated, but Eric couldn't focus on them. The only thing he could focus on was the Quen standing before him. Sarah looked at the council with a raised hand, signaling for silence. She spoke again. "This alliance will bring peace to both our worlds. It will cement our future together." She paused for a moment as her gaze drifted back to Eric. "You have proven yourself capable of thinking outside the box, perhaps a little too much at times. But it is exactly this kind of thinking that will help us overcome the challenges ahead." Eric was still trying to wrap his head around the situation. He had been expecting a refusal, or perhaps mockery, not this quiet acceptance that seemed to come with its own weight. He glanced nervously at his colleagues, who were now exchanging glances among themselves. But no one said a word as they waited for his next move. Quensara's eyes softened slightly as she observed him. She stepped closer to him in a slow, deliberate motion. And for a moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background. There was only her and him, the tension between them palpable, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. "Eric," she said his name as if testing it out, as if the sound of it in her mouth was something new. "We have much to discuss, but first we must address the reactions of your people and mine." She took a deep breath before turning to the council. "Once more, this decision will change the course of history, and not I will approve of it. But I will not back down." The room fell silent once again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the silence of uncertainty. It was a silence that felt heavy with something else, with the promise of something bigger. Eric swallowed hard, still unsure if he was even awake, if this was some strange dream he had gotten lost in. Sarah turned back to him, and her gaze softened for the briefest of moments. Something like respect, something like understanding passed between them. And in that instant, Eric realized something that sent a chill through his spine. This wasn't just a political move. This wasn't some diplomatic maneuver. She had accepted him, not just because of his position, not just because it made sense politically, but because she saw something in him, something he didn't fully understand yet. "Prepare yourself, Eric," she said, her voice now a little gentler. "This will not be easy, but we must face it together. And whatever happens from here on out, we will walk this path as one." Her eyes locked with his, and for the first time he saw something other than calculation in her gaze. He saw something almost human, a flicker of trust, and maybe, just maybe, something more. And as the council continued their heated discussions, Eric found himself at the center of something far greater than he could have ever imagined. A path that had begun with a ridiculous mistake had now become the beginning of something that could change the fate of both their worlds forever. Eric sat in his quarters, staring out of the window at the vast alien landscape that stretched out before him. His mind was still reeling from the events of the past few hours. He had come here to negotiate peace, to prevent a war between his people and Queen Zara's empire. But now he found himself entangled in something far more complex than he had ever imagined. The weight of the Queen's words still echoed in his mind. She had accepted his proposal, and he had no idea what that meant for him or for anyone else. He rubbed his temples trying to focus, but every time he thought about it, his thoughts scattered in all directions. How could he explain this to his superiors? How could he even begin to process what had happened? There was no way they would believe him. They would think he was joking, or worse, that he had somehow betrayed them by getting too close to the Queen. But this wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was real, and it had consequences. Eric could feel it in the air around him. A sharp knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he jumped in surprise. He stood up quickly and opened the door to find one of the human council members standing in front of him, her face grim. "Eric, we need to talk," she said in a low voice, her eyes flicking nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be listening. "The others are waiting for you in the strategy room. We need to figure out how to handle this." Eric nodded silently and followed her down the narrow corridor toward the strategy room, his thoughts swirling with a mix of fear and confusion. What could they possibly do now? He had no answers, but everyone was waiting for him to have them. He felt the pressure of the moment pressing down on him harder with each step. The council had been briefed on the Queen's unexpected acceptance of his proposal, and now they expected him to provide a plan for how to proceed. The strategy room was dark and filled with people from both the human delegation and the alien council. The atmosphere was tense as they all turned to face Eric as he entered, their eyes filled with suspicion and uncertainty. No one knew what to make of the situation. No one knew how to react to the fact that Eric was now the fiancé of the most powerful ruler in the galaxy. "Sit down, Eric," the lead human diplomat said, gesturing to the seat at the table. "We need to figure out how to spin this, and fast." Her voice was sharp and demanding, and Eric couldn't help but feel like he was under a microscope as everyone watched him intently. He sat down slowly, his hands shaking as he tried to process the gravity of the situation. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice quiet but heavy with the weight of his words. "I never intended for this to happen. It was a mistake. It was just a slip of the tongue, but now the Queen has accepted and was stuck with it." His words hung in the air, and no one spoke for a long time. Finally, one of the alien council members spoke up, his voice thick with disdain. "This is more than a mistake, Eric," he said, his eyes narrowing. "This is a political maneuver of the highest order. She has accepted you not just as a diplomatic partner, but as her consort. You've been thrust into the center of a power play, and now you must choose a side." His words were like a slap to the face, and Eric felt the weight of them sink into his chest. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He had always known that diplomacy was a dangerous game, but this was something entirely different. He had been swept into the heart of a galactic struggle, and now his every move would be scrutinized. His every decision would affect the fate of both human and alien lives. Another council member spoke up, this time a human woman who had been silent up until now. "Eric, what we need to figure out is what the Queen really wants. Why did she accept your proposal? What is her true agenda?" Her eyes were sharp as she studied him, waiting for an answer. Eric shook his head, his mind a blur. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know what she wants, but I can't shake the feeling that there's something more to this than just politics." She looked at me like she saw something in me, something I didn't expect. He trailed off, unable to put his thoughts into words. The room fell silent again as everyone mulled over his words, the tension thickening with every passing second. The implications of the Queen's decision were still unfolding, and no one could predict where this would lead. But one thing was clear: no one was prepared for the path that was about to open up before them. Arik felt his stomach twist into knots as he realized that his life had just taken a turn into the unknown. His relationship with the Queen was no longer just a political alliance. It was something much deeper and far more dangerous, and no one could predict what consequences would come from the unexpected bond they now shared. Arik couldn't sleep that night. The weight of everything was too much to process. His mind kept racing, replaying every word, every action, every moment from the day that had seemed to spiral out of control. Yet there was one thing that kept nagging at him, one thing he couldn't shake: the feeling that Queen Sara's acceptance wasn't a mere political maneuver. It wasn't just a random act of kindness or a spontaneous decision. There was a purpose behind it, something hidden beneath the surface that he had yet to understand. The next morning he was summoned to meet with the Queen in her private chambers. Her guards ushered him in without a word, and as he stepped inside, he was struck by the stark contrast between the opulence of the room and the coldness of the Queen herself. She was seated at a large desk, her back straight, her posture regal and commanding as always. But today there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. She seemed more distant, more focused on something else. "Sit, Arik," she said without looking up from the holographic display in front of her, her tone still smooth, but there was an edge to it, something sharper than before. Arik hesitated for a moment before taking the seat across from her, his heart racing. He knew something was different now. She wasn't just the cold political figure he had seen her as in the council chamber last night. She was something else entirely, and he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Sara glanced up at him finally, her eyes piercing, as if she were trying to see into his very soul. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said, her voice softer than usual, but still commanding. "And I've come to a decision." She paused for a moment before continuing. "There are forces at play in my empire, forces that want to see it crumble from within, and they will stop at nothing to bring about my downfall." Arik's breath caught in his throat. His mind immediately began racing. What was she talking about? What forces, what dangers was she referring to? "I've been aware of these threats for some time," she continued, her gaze never wavering from his face. "But it is not enough to simply face them with strength." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping lower as she spoke. "I need more than just an alliance. I need something more personal, something that will make my enemies second-guess at every move, and that something is you." Arik blinked in confusion, his mind struggling to comprehend her words. What did she mean by something personal? Was he just a pawn in her game? Was this all some elaborate scheme to solidify her power and control? "I need you, Arik," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your presence will strengthen my position. Your alliance with me will give me the edge I need to outmaneuver those who would see me dead." Arik was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Queen was admitting to something he had suspected, but had been too afraid to acknowledge: that he wasn't here just as a diplomat, that his proposal had not been the reason for her decision, but rather a calculated move in her grand scheme. Sara leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I didn't accept your proposal out of some foolish whim, or because I thought it would be a simple solution," she said, her eyes hardening. "I accepted it because it will serve a purpose. It will give me the leverage I need to crush my enemies and keep my throne secure." Arik's heart pounded in his chest. The realization of what was happening began to settle in. He was not just a human caught in the middle of an intergalactic power struggle. He was now a key piece in a dangerous game, one that could end with the destruction of an entire empire. He struggled to find his voice as he looked at the Queen sitting before him. She had manipulated the situation from the beginning, had planned for his blunder to unfold exactly as it had. She had used his mistake to further her own goals, and now he was trapped in her web of lies and deceit. Sara's gaze softened just slightly as if sensing his internal conflict, but there was no sympathy in her eyes, only the cold calculation of a ruler who knew how to use every tool at her disposal. "Don't misunderstand me, Arik," she said, her voice almost gentle. "This is not personal. It is a matter of survival." She paused, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something darker. "If you want to survive here, if you want to make it out alive, you will do exactly as I say." Arik swallowed hard. The weight of her words, hanging in the air like a sword, ready to drop. His life had changed in an instant. He had walked into this room as an unwitting diplomat, and now he was caught in the web of the Queen's ambitions. There was no turning back, no escaping the path that had been set before him. "I understand," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he truly did understand, or if he was simply trying to convince himself that he could survive whatever came next. Sarah nodded once and then turned back to her holographic display, as if the conversation had never happened. "Good, now we begin," she said, her voice cold and authoritative, and in that moment Eric realized that he was no longer just an outsider to this empire. He was now part of something much darker than he had ever imagined. Eric left the Queen's chambers with a heavy heart. The weight of her words had settled deep into his chest. As he walked down the long corridors of the palace, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had just signed away his freedom. There was no going back now. He was tangled in the web of her ambitions, and there was no way to untangle himself, not without risking everything. He couldn't help but replay her words over and over again in his mind, her cold and calculating tone, her admission that he was nothing more than a pawn in her game, a tool to secure her power. But even as the bitterness of that truth settled in, he knew that he had no choice but to comply. He was in too deep now to back out. He had to play along or face the consequences. The halls were eerily quiet as he walked through the palace, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The silence seemed to press down on him with every step, and he could feel the weight of every guard's gaze. As he passed them, he had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable than he did in that moment. When he reached his quarters, he collapsed into the chair by the window, staring out at the alien city. Below, the lights of the city sparkled in the distance, but they did little to ease the turmoil inside him. He had been sent here on a diplomatic mission to prevent war, to bring peace between his people and the Empire, and now he found himself caught in the middle of a political game that could destroy everything he had worked for. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated and uncertain. There were so many things he didn't understand, so many questions he couldn't answer. Why had Queen Sarah chosen him? Why had she made him part of her plans? Had she seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself? Or was he just another tool to her, another means to an end? The door to his quarters slid open with a soft hiss, and Eric turned to see one of the human council members standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry. She stepped inside quickly and closed the door behind her. "Eric, we need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. He stood up and crossed the room to meet her. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. She glanced around the room, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening before speaking again. "There are rumors, Eric, rumors, that the Queen's decision to marry you wasn't just for political leverage." She paused before continuing, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him uneasy. "There's something more going on here, something we don't fully understand." Eric frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked, his mind still racing with the implications of his meeting with the Queen. "We've heard whispers," she said, her voice low and tense. "Whispers about a plot against the Queen's life, a conspiracy within her own ranks, people who want to see her overthrown, and they're using you to get to her." Eric's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a punch to the gut. A plot against the Queen's life. How could that be possible? He had thought he was just a pawn in her political game. But this was something else entirely. "Are you saying I'm a target?" he asked, his voice shaky with the weight of the situation. She nodded grimly. "You're not just a pawn, Eric. You're a key player in something much bigger than you realize." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "And we need to figure out what's really going on before it's too late." Eric felt a cold chill run down his spine. The room seemed to grow smaller as the gravity of her words sank in. He had thought he was in control of the situation, but now he realized that he was just as much at the mercy of the Queen's enemies as he was at her side. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The council member took a deep breath. "We need to get information. We need to find out who's behind this plot and why they're targeting the Queen," she said, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. "And we need to do it without drawing attention to ourselves. If anyone suspects that we're involved, we'll be dead before we even have a chance to fight back." Arik nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. He had no idea who he could trust or where to begin, but one thing was clear: he was no longer just a diplomat. He was now a player in a game of life and death, a game where the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. "All right," he said, finally, his voice steady, but his mind still reeling. "We'll figure this out, but we need to move quickly before the Queen's enemies make their move." The council member gave him a grim nod and turned to leave, but before she could reach the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Be careful, Arik," she said, her voice filled with warning. "This is a dangerous game, and one wrong move could cost you everything." Arik watched her leave, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of her words settled in. He had already lost so much, but now he realized that the true cost of his involvement with Queen Zara's empire was far greater than he had ever imagined. Arik spent the next few days in a haze of constant tension. Every step he took seemed to echo through the halls of the palace. Every whisper in the dark felt like a dagger aimed at his back. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. The more he learned about the conspiracy against Queen Zara, the more uncertain everything became. His position was no longer just precarious, it was dangerous, and he was in the center of it all, whether he liked it or not. He met with the council member again in secret, this time in a dimly lit corridor, far from the eyes of the Queen's guards. They had agreed to meet in places where no one would think to look. But even now, Arik could feel the weight of their surroundings, the walls closing in on him with every passing moment. "We need to move fast, Arik," the council member said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've gotten word that there's a meeting tonight, a secret one where the conspirators will discuss their next move. If we can get in and listen in, we might be able to uncover their plan before they make their move." Arik nodded, his heart racing at the thought of getting involved in something this dangerous. But he knew they didn't have much choice. It was either act now or risk losing everything they were trying to protect. "Where is the meeting?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "It's in the lower levels of the palace," she replied, "where most of the maintenance and storage rooms are. No one goes down there except for a few select individuals, so it's the perfect place to hold a meeting like this." Arik's heart skipped a beat, the cold realization hitting him like a blow to the chest. He wasn't just a pawn in Zara's game. He was the target of a deadly conspiracy, one that would end his life and the Queen's in a single strike. He turned to the council member, his face pale with fear. "We need to get out of here now," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. She nodded quickly, and they began to move silently back through the maze of corridors, their every step calculated to avoid detection. But as they turned a corner, they were met with the sharp sound of footsteps approaching. Their hearts raced in unison as they froze in place. The footsteps grew louder and closer, Arik's breath caught in his throat as he looked around desperately for an escape route. But there was nowhere to hide, no way to avoid being seen. The figures approached, and it was only a matter of seconds before they would be caught in the act. Then the council member made a decision. She grabbed Arik's arm and pulled him toward a small maintenance closet. Just ahead, she shoved him inside and slammed the door shut behind them. Their breaths were shallow and frantic as they tried to calm their nerves. They were trapped, and their lives were now in the hands of the conspirators who wanted them both dead. Arik's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed his back against the cold walls of the maintenance closet. The darkness around him felt suffocating, and the silence unbearable. Each breath he took seemed louder than the last. The footsteps outside continued their rhythmic march, growing closer by the second. But neither he nor the council member dared make a sound. They stood frozen in place, every muscle tense, every nerve on edge, waiting for the inevitable moment when they would be discovered. They held their breath as the footsteps passed the closet door. Arik could hear the muffled conversation of the conspirators, but he couldn't make out the words. The tension in the air felt thick, like it could choke him. The sound of voices grew distant and eventually faded away, leaving only the oppressive silence of the dark room. They waited for what felt like hours before Arik finally exhaled, his breath shaky with relief. "That was too close," he whispered, his voice low and strained. "We can't keep doing this, we're running out of time." The council member gave a small nod, still catching her breath. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But we have no choice, not now, not when we're this close to uncovering everything. Arik felt a knot form in his stomach. As the weight of her words sank in, they had no choice. He realized he had been hoping for some easy out, some simple solution, where they could leave the palace and return to the safety of their home world. But now he saw that there was no escape from the trap. They had walked into no simple way to fix the mess they had made. We need to find the source of this plot. The council member continued, her voice steady, despite the fear that still lingered in her eyes. If we can get to the heart of it, we can stop them before it's too late. Arik nodded slowly. He understood the stakes better now than ever before. This wasn't just about exposing a conspiracy anymore. It was about survival, not just for him, but for the Queen. And for everyone who had trusted him with this mission. He was no longer just a diplomat trying to broker peace. He was a target, someone whose life could end in an instant if he made the wrong move. They crept through the lower halls of the palace, once more moving like shadows, avoiding the patrols, and slipping through the darkened corridors. They had already learned the palace's patterns, and now it was just a matter of finding the right pieces of information before the conspirators made their move. Arik's mind raced with questions that he couldn't answer. Where had this all started? Who was behind it? And why hadn't the Queen seen it coming? She was a ruler, powerful and sharp, yet she had been blind to the dangers that lurked in the shadows of her own empire. The council member stopped suddenly and motioned for him to be quiet. She pressed her ear against the wall, listening for a moment, before nodding and pulling him forward. They were nearing the heart of the palace, now where the highest-ranking officials met in secret, and where Arik knew the conspirators would have left their marks somewhere among the countless hidden chambers and abandoned halls. They came to a door at the end of a long corridor, a faint light of a hidden panel illuminating the space in front of them. The council member moved swiftly, her hands working with practiced precision to disable the security lock. Arik stood by, watching, his senses on high alert, ready for anything. With a soft click, the door opened, and they stepped inside. The room was small and contained nothing but a few tables and chairs, but it was clear that this was where the most important decisions were made, hidden away from prying eyes. The walls were lined with holographic maps and encrypted files, all scattered across the tables as if they had been hastily left behind. "This is it," the council member said softly. "This is where they plan everything." Arik felt a chill run down his spine as he glanced around the room. Everything seemed so deliberate, so well organized, as if someone had been preparing for this moment for months or even years. He could feel the tension building with every second they spent in the room, knowing that their every action was being watched from somewhere in the shadows. The council member began to sift through the scattered papers, her hands moving quickly as she searched for anything that might give them a clue about the conspiracy's true leader, the mastermind behind the plot to bring down the Queen. Arik stood watch by the door, his ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps. His thoughts raced as he considered the possibility that they were already too late, that the conspirators had known they were coming and had set a trap just for them. Suddenly, the council member froze, her face pale, as she stared down at a file she had just opened, her fingers trembling. As she turned the page, Arik's stomach twisted as he moved closer to see what she had found. It was a list of names, all marked with red X next to them, and at the very top was one name that made his blood run cold. Queen Zara's name. Arik's heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto the name at the top of the list, Queen Zara. He couldn't breathe for a moment. The room seemed to close in around him as the full weight of what they had discovered hit him like a tidal wave. The conspirators weren't just plotting her death. They had already planned every detail, down to the smallest move. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and now he realized that moment might already be upon them. "This can't be right," Arik whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "They're planning to kill her. But why go through all this just to remove her?" The council member's hands shook as she sifted through more documents, her eyes scanning the text frantically. "It's not just that, Arik," she said, her voice tight with fear. "They want to replace her, they want to take over the empire, and they've been setting the stage for this for years." Arik stepped closer, his mind spinning as he tried to piece everything together. But who are they? Who's behind this? "It's not just one person," she replied, her voice trembling as she looked at the list. It's a coalition of powerful figures from both the human and alien factions, people who want to see the Empire divided and weakened so they can seize control for themselves. Eric's mind raced with the implications of what she was saying. The Empire was on the brink of collapse, and they were standing in the very heart of the conspiracy that threatened to tear everything apart. He had thought he was just caught in the middle of a political struggle, but now he saw the truth. This wasn't just about power, it was about control and manipulation on a scale he had never imagined. "We need to warn her," Eric said urgently, his voice raw with emotion. "We can't let them get away with this. She has to know what's happening." The council member nodded grimly. "We will, but we need to be careful," she said. "The moment we reveal what we know, they'll come for us too, and we'll be just as dead as the Queen if we're not careful." Eric clenched his fists in frustration. The walls seemed to be closing in around him. The threat of the conspirators was real, and every second they spent here was a second closer to their discovery. The danger was suffocating, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. They had to move fast, but the question remained, how could they get the information to the Queen without alerting the conspirators to their plans? And how could they do it without risking their own lives in the process? The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor outside the door, and Eric's breath caught in his throat. The guards were getting closer. They had to leave now, or they would be caught in the act. "We need to go," he said urgently, grabbing the council member's arm and pulling her toward the door. "Wait," she whispered sharply. "We can't leave empty-handed." She pulled one last file from the table and shoved it into her bag before moving quickly to the door. "Let's move," she hissed. They slipped through the corridors as silently as they could, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting beneath them. But Eric could feel the tension in the air with every passing second, that every move was a gamble, a risk they couldn't afford to lose. But they had no choice. They couldn't stay here any longer, and they couldn't afford to be caught now. When they reached the stairs leading back up to the upper levels, they paused for a moment to catch their breath. The heavy silence of the lower levels now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the urgency of the moment. That only focus was on escaping without being detected. "We have to tell her," Eric said again, his voice desperate, his mind still racing with all the things they hadn't done, yet all the information they still needed to act on. The council member nodded. "I know," she said, "but we have to be smart about this. We can't just walk into the Queen's chambers and spill everything we know. They'll be watching for any sign of us trying to warn her." Eric's frustration flared as the weight of their situation bore down on him. The Queen's life was on the line, and they were running out of time, but they couldn't just rush in recklessly. They had to think through every step carefully, or risk making things worse. "How do we do this, then?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and fear. "We'll need to use the communication network," she replied, her voice low and urgent. "We can't do it through normal channels, but I know of a way to get a message to her without being traced. We'll use an old secure line that only a few people know about." "But we don't have much time," Eric said, his voice rising. "What if they make their move tonight?" "That's why we're moving now," the council member said, her eyes narrowing with determination. "We can't waste any more time." They made their way quickly through the palace, moving with purpose, but every corner, every shadow seemed to hide danger. They were running out of time, and they knew it. The conspirators were already one step ahead of them, and if they didn't act fast, everything they had worked for would be lost. Eric's thoughts were consumed by the one thing that mattered now. Queen Sara, her life hung in the balance, and they had no more time to waste. The message had to get through or all would be lost. They reached the communication room without incident, their movements quick and calculated. The air was thick with tension. Every second felt like an eternity. As they rushed to the terminal, the council member swiftly typed in a series of commands, bypassing the security protocols that protected the network. Only a few knew how to access this hidden channel, and it was their only hope of getting the message to the Queen without anyone discovering what they were doing. "We're almost there," the council member muttered under her breath as her fingers danced across the keys. The terminal hummed quietly in response, the screen flickering to life with encrypted messages and data streams. Eric stood guard by the door, his eyes darting to every shadow as he tried to push the anxiety gnawing at him to the back of his mind. The sound of his heartbeat was deafening in his ears as he watched the council member work her hands, moving like lightning through the complex system. The door to the room suddenly slammed open, and two guards burst in their eyes, scanning the space with deadly precision. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, instinctively positioning himself between the council member and the guards. "Stop right there," one of the guards barked, his weapon raised. Eric's heart raced, but he didn't move a muscle, his mind whirling with options. There was no time to think through a careful escape plan. The only choice was to act fast and deal with the consequences later. Before either of the guards could react, Eric lunged forward with lightning speed, knocking the weapon from the first guard's hand with a sharp twist and sending him crashing into the wall with a force that left the air vibrating. He pivoted to face the second guard, who hesitated for a moment. Before aiming his weapon, Eric moved faster than the guard could react, his fist connecting with the guard's chest and sending him sprawling to the ground. He barely had time to breathe before the council member's voice cut through the chaos. "It's done," she said, her voice filled with urgency as she turned to him. "I sent the message to the Queen. She'll know what's happening. But we don't have much time. We need to leave now." Eric didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed the council member's arm and yanked her toward the door as the first guard groaned and tried to push himself to his feet. Eric slammed the door shut behind them, and they sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing through the halls with every passing second, the weight of the situation pressing down on them harder than ever. They rounded a corner and ran straight into another pair of guards. These ones were faster and more prepared for confrontation. One of them raised a gun, but Eric acted on instinct, grabbing the barrel and twisting it out of the guard's hands before knocking him unconscious with a single punch. The other guard hesitated for a moment too long before Eric caught him off guard with a knee to the stomach and followed it up with a swift elbow to the back of the head. "We don't have time for this," Eric panted as he helped the council member to her feet. They pushed forward, but the palace was beginning to stir. Alarms blared overhead, signaling that the breach had been detected. Eric could hear the sound of more guards rushing to intercept them, their footsteps growing louder as they ran through the dimly lit halls. "This way," the council member said, pulling him down a side corridor that led toward a hidden exit. "We need to reach the underground tunnels that'll take us out of the palace without anyone knowing." They didn't stop to look back as they raced through the winding passages, their breaths ragged with exertion. Every turn brought them closer to freedom, but the palace was vast and filled with guards on every level. They couldn't afford to slow down, not for a second. As they neared the exit, Eric's mind raced, thinking of the Queen and the message they had sent to her. Would it be enough? Would she believe them? Would she be able to stop the conspiracy before it was too late? "We're almost there," the council member said, her voice filled with determination. "Just a little further." They reached the exit, but as they stepped outside into the cool night air, a group of guards appeared at the entrance, blocking their way. Eric's heart sank as he realized there was no way out, no escape, no easy route to safety. The council member stepped forward. "We've got no choice now," she said, her eyes hard with resolve. "We fight." Eric nodded. He was ready to do whatever it took to stop this madness. The stakes had never been higher, and the enemy was closing in on all sides, but they still had a chance. They still had their lives and their resolve, and they would fight with everything they had. They rushed forward. The guards met them with drawn weapons, but Eric's determination burned brighter than ever as he fought alongside the council member. There was no turning back now. The battle for survival had begun, and there was no telling who would come out on top. But one thing was certain: the fate of the Queen and the Empire hung in the balance, and Eric was ready to risk everything to see it through to the end.